Subscribe to Echo Tales for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Elena received the message that would stir something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a warm throw blanket, scrolling absent-mindedly through old photos when her phone buzzed. The message was from her husband, Daniel. Formal, dinner, Friday night, 7 p.m. My boss wants to meet the spouses. That was it. Brief, emotionless, like most of their conversations lately. Elena stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than necessary, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked over. At the dining room where Daniel had left his laptop open, no doubt still working. That laptop had become more familiar to her than his touch. It wasn't that she didn't love him anymore. No. Love still flickered somewhere deep beneath the surface, like the faint warmth of an ember in ashes. But the closeness they once shared had long given way to routine. The everyday things, groceries, bills, checking in on each other out of habit, not hunger, had filled the space between them until even silence felt crowded. By Friday afternoon, Elena stood in front of the mirror, trying on her third dress. She didn't know why she cared so much. It wasn't like Daniel ever noticed these things. Still, something inside her insisted that she get it right. She finally chose a navy blue satin dress, elegant, soft on the skin, and modest enough not to stand out, but graceful enough to feel like herself again. She paired it with simple earrings and a light perfume she hadn't worn in years, the one she used to wear when they were newly married, and everything still felt like a beginning. The restaurant Daniel took her to that night was stunning, expensive, clearly chosen to impress. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above white linen-covered tables. The waiters wore gloves, and the piano in the corner whispered out a soft jazz tune that made the whole place feel like it belonged in a different time. They were the last to arrive. As they approached the reserved table, a tall man stood and extended his hand. "You must be Elena," he said with a soft smile. "I've heard not enough about you." His voice was smooth but grounded, and his eyes held a gentleness that didn't match the sharp navy suit he wore. This was Adrian Locke, Daniel's boss. Elena wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't him. Something in the way he looked at her made her stomach flutter, and not in the way strangers usually did. It wasn't attraction exactly. It was attention. A rare, focused kind of presence that made her feel seen, even though she hadn't said a word. Throughout the dinner, Adrian asked her more questions than Daniel had in weeks. He wanted to know about her interests, her past, the little details she often kept to herself because no one ever asked. She found herself smiling, laughing even, and every time she glanced across the table at Adrian, she found his eyes already on her. Not invasive, not flirtatious, just curious. Daniel, on the other hand, spent most of the meal on and off, his phone, making quick comments, smiling at the wrong moments. As dessert was served, Adrian leaned in slightly, his tone quieter. "It's a shame when quiet talents go unseen," he said. "Sometimes people forget to look." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what he meant, or maybe she did. She just wasn't ready to admit it. That night didn't end with drama or declarations, but as they walked to the valet, something had already changed. She couldn't explain it. She only knew that a door had quietly opened somewhere in the corners of her heart, and through it came a question she wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. The soft clink of glasses and low murmur of elegant conversation filled the restaurant like background music to a forgotten dream. Elena sat between two versions of her life. On one side, Daniel, her husband of 7 years, still checking his phone under the table. On the other, Adrian Locke, her husband's boss, who somehow made the room quieter every time he turned to her. He was listening, not just hearing her words, but listening in that rare way people do when they actually care what you say. She had always believed she was easy to overlook. Even as a child, she spoke softly and moved gently, as if afraid to disturb the world around her. When she met Daniel, his boldness had been like gravity, pulling her in, making her feel like she belonged to someone with certainty. But over time, certainty had turned into silence. Now their conversations were mostly about groceries, bills, and what time to pick up the dry cleaning. There was no space for softness anymore. But Adrian was different. When he asked what she did, Elena hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had cared to know. "I used to paint," she said softly, "before everything else took over." He looked at her, truly looked. "What did you paint?" "Mostly women," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Faces that held things they couldn't say." "I'd like to see them someday," Adrian replied. His voice wasn't flirtatious. It was sincere. And that sincerity did something to her, something dangerous. It made her feel remembered, even though they had only just met. Daniel chuckled as he sipped his wine. "Elena's being modest. She hasn't picked up a brush in years. Life gets in the way, you know?" Elena smiled politely, but her heart dimmed a little. Daniel didn't mean it cruelly, but his words felt like a lid placed on something fragile. Adrian, however, didn't laugh. His gaze stayed steady, thoughtful. "Maybe life gets in the way because we let it," Adrian said, not taking his eyes off Elena. "Or maybe no one reminds us it's okay to keep something for ourselves." She didn't know how to respond. So she looked down at her glass, pretending to notice the way the candlelight caught the rim. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set it down. There was something happening at that table, something unspoken, but deeply felt. A shifting of air, a slow awakening inside her chest. Elena wasn't falling in love, not in the way stories say it happens, but she was beginning to remember a version of herself that had long gone quiet. Adrian wasn't pushing, just noticing, and after so many years of being invisible, being noticed felt intimate. As the server cleared the dishes, Adrian leaned slightly toward her. His voice was low, barely a whisper above the hum of the room. "It's a strange thing," he said, watching someone shine in silence, like finding a light and realizing no one ever turned it on. Elena's eyes widened just a little. The words lingered in the space between them, warm and heavy. She didn't know what to say, because she didn't know what she was allowed to feel. Daniel was already checking his phone again. And Adrian, he simply looked at her, not asking for anything, not needing to. That look alone was enough to make her wonder how long she had been dimming her own light, just to keep the peace. She didn't know what the night meant yet. But she knew somehow. It wasn't just dinner. It was the beginning of something she hadn't seen coming. By the time they stepped out of the restaurant, the city sky had opened up. A soft rain was falling. Not quite a storm, but heavy enough to mist Elena's hair and make the pavement glisten like glass. Daniel's phone rang the moment the valet took their ticket. Without a second glance, he walked a few steps away to answer it, his voice already shifting into that clipped, business-like tone he used when speaking to colleagues. Elena was left standing under the soft awning of the entrance, alone except for Adrian. He was still there, just a step behind her, his presence steady and quiet. The air between them had grown quieter too, but not empty, more like the pause between heartbeats. Elena folded her arms, partly from the cold, partly to keep herself from doing something foolish like stepping closer to him. She hadn't even realized she was shivering until Adrian slipped off his coat and gently placed it around her shoulders. She turned to him quickly. "You don't have to—" "I know," he said, his voice calm. "But you looked cold, that's all." She swallowed. The coat was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and something softer, something that didn't belong to Daniel or to this version of her life. It felt strange to accept kindness that didn't come with explanations or expectations. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that holds weight, not awkwardness. Elena didn't know how to look at him, so she looked out at the city lights, blurry and golden through the rain. Then Adrian asked her the question that would echo in her mind for nights to come. "Are you happy?" The words landed like a ripple on still water, gentle, but impossible to ignore. She blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Adrian's eyes stayed on the street, not pushing. "With him, with how small you've been asked to become." Elena's breath hitched. She wasn't prepared for that. No one had ever asked her something so naked, so personal, so close to the question she'd been avoiding even in her own mind. She turned to him, startled, but he didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The question wasn't meant to be answered out loud. It was one of those things meant to settle deep inside and change you from the inside out. "I'm fine," she said after a pause. But the words came out thin and hollow, like paper stretched, too tight. Adrian finally looked at her then. "You deserve more than fine, Elena." And that was it. No more words, no declarations. No confessions, just that. A simple sentence, spoken in the rain, under the quiet glow of a street lamp. Daniel returned a minute later, still half in conversation, barely noticing the coat around her shoulders or the silence that lingered between his wife and his boss. He muttered something about traffic and deals and deadlines, and Elena nodded, numb. In the car ride home, Daniel talked about work, money, and his growing portfolio. Elena said very little. Her eyes stayed on the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. But inside her, something had shifted. Adrian hadn't made a move. He hadn't crossed any lines. And yet, he had seen her more clearly in one evening than Daniel had in years. That night, Elena lay awake long after Daniel fell asleep beside her. She thought about Adrian's question, about the word happy, and how far she had drifted from it. And even though she didn't have an answer yet, she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer fine. Back home, everything looked the same, but felt completely different. The quiet apartment that usually gave Elena a sense of peace now felt hollow, like a space once filled with music, now holding only the echo. Daniel slipped off his shoes, muttered something about a report he needed to finish, and headed straight to the home office, where his laptop was waiting like a second heartbeat. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him disappear, behind the half-closed door, not even glancing back. She turned toward the bedroom, her hands still clutching Adrian's coat. She should have taken it off by now, but she hadn't. Something about the weight of it around her shoulders made her feel anchored, seen, held, in a way that hadn't happened in years. She walked to the mirror, paused in front of it, and looked at herself. Not just at the reflection, but at the woman staring back. Her face looked tired, not from the dinner or the evening, but from years of being folded into someone else's shadow. She slowly took off the coat, running her fingers along the collar, and hung it gently over the chair beside her bed. For a moment, she just stood there, as if unsure what to do with her hands. Everything inside her felt too loud for the silence of the room. She checked her phone absent-mindedly, and there it was, a message from Adrian. "I hope you didn't mind my question." 10 words. That was it. No punctuation except the period. No emojis. No expectation. Just a quiet sentence that landed in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She didn't reply. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. What could she possibly say? That no one had asked her anything real in months? That she had forgotten the sound of her own longing? That a single evening had shaken something loose inside her that she wasn't ready to face? She placed the phone, face down on the nightstand, then turned off the bedside lamp. In the darkness, Daniel's fingers clicked away on his keyboard from the next room, steady, uninterrupted, unaware. And that perhaps was what hurt the most. Not that Adrian had seen her, but that Daniel hadn't even noticed she'd been gone. Elena closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep, but the question kept floating up, like a feather she couldn't pin down. Are you happy? She tried to tell herself that she was, that she had everything she needed. A roof over her head, a husband who worked hard, no major arguments, no betrayals, no drama. Everything looked right on the outside, but the inside told a different story. She remembered the way Adrian had looked at her, not as someone's wife, not as someone who had settled, but as someone who still had something to become. He hadn't offered her an escape. He'd offered her a mirror. And sometimes, the most painful truths come not from insults or cruelty, but from being seen too clearly. That night, Elena didn't dream. Or if she did, she couldn't remember it. But in the morning, when she made coffee and passed by the chair where Adrian's coat still hung, she paused. Her fingers brushed the sleeve before she walked away. And in that small gesture, something unspoken passed between who she had been and who she was beginning to remember. It had been 3 days since the dinner. 3 days since Adrian's words had settled into Elena's bones like an echo that wouldn't fade. She hadn't replied to his message, but she hadn't deleted it either. It stayed in her phone like a whisper, something quiet but persistent, reminding her that someone had looked at her and seen her, not as an extension of someone else, but as a whole person. Daniel hadn't mentioned the dinner since. He hadn't noticed her change in mood, or the way she lingered a little longer at windows, or how often she touched Adrian's coat, still draped over the bedroom chair. It was almost as if that evening never happened. As if the shift that had cracked open inside her heart hadn't echoed through the walls of their marriage. That morning, Elena walked past her hallway closet, the one where she kept a few forgotten boxes from their early days. On impulse, she opened it. The smell of dust and old linen greeted her. She knelt down and pulled out a large flat box from the bottom. Inside it, wrapped in thin paper, were her brushes, her old sketch pads, and a folded smock stained with colors from a different life. Her hands trembled as she lifted a canvas from the bottom. The last painting she had worked on was unfinished. A woman, eyes wide but mouth closed, as if holding in a truth too dangerous to speak. Elena stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening. She remembered the day she stopped painting. There had been no dramatic decision, just a slow erosion of time, space, and attention. The colors had faded from her hands long before she noticed. Later that afternoon, after Daniel left for another meeting, Elena cleared a space by the window and set the canvas up. She unwrapped her brushes with care, fingers tracing the worn wooden handles like reuniting with an old friend. The paint tubes had dried, but she didn't care. It wasn't about finishing the painting. It was about starting again. She dipped a brush into water and touched it to the canvas, soft and tentative. At first, the strokes were awkward. Her hands, unsure, her confidence flickering. But as the light shifted across the room, something loosened in her shoulders. Something long asleep began to stir. And then the doorbell rang. Startled, she wiped her hands and opened the door, only to find Adrian standing there. He didn't smile right away. His gaze moved past her, over her shoulder, to the canvas near the window. "I was nearby," he said gently, "and I wasn't sure if I should come. I just wanted to return the book Daniel lent me. That's all." Elena nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. She should have stepped back, said a quick thank you and closed the door, but she didn't. Instead, she said, "Would you like to come in?" Adrian hesitated, then stepped inside. His eyes went straight to the painting, his expression softening. "You started again," he said, voice almost a whisper. "I don't know why," Elena replied, her throat tight. "It just felt like the right time." He turned to her. "Maybe because someone reminded you that you still matter." Silence stretched between them. Not heavy, not awkward, just full. Elena didn't move. Neither did Adrian. Nothing happened. No touch. No line crossed. But something bloomed in that room, quietly, beautifully, like a flower opening in a place where no one thought it could grow again, and in that bloom she began to understand. This wasn't about falling for someone else. It was about finally remembering who she was before she forgot. The days that followed moved like slow, warm rain, quiet but cleansing. Elena didn't see Adrian again, not in person. He hadn't. Tried to overstep, hadn't messaged again. And maybe that's what made it all feel more real. It wasn't a pursuit. It wasn't temptation in the usual sense. It was a mirror held up to her heart. A moment of being seen, deeply, without demand. But something had changed. Not just in her, but around her. Daniel started to notice her absences. He would come home and see her painting, sitting quietly near the window, brush in hand, music, playing softly in the background. He would pause at the doorway, almost confused, like seeing someone he hadn't realized he married. One evening, as she wiped her hands and turned to greet him, he finally asked, "Are you okay?" It was such a simple question, but it landed too late. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I think I'm remembering who I am, Daniel. And it feels strange." He furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" You've always been fine. Fine." There it was again. That word, that silent cage she had lived inside. She wanted to get angry, to shout that she hadn't been fine in years, but instead she just nodded slowly. "I know." That night, they sat at opposite sides of the couch, watching a movie neither of them remembered 10 minutes in. Elena wasn't angry, just quiet, calm, the kind of calm that comes when you finally stopped pretending. 2 days later, Adrian sent her one last message. It was short. "I won't reach out again. I don't want to complicate your world. But if your world ever changes, and you want to be seen again, I'll be somewhere without expectations." She stared at the message for a long time. Her heart didn't race. There was no rush of adrenaline, no flurry of forbidden emotions. Instead, there was stillness. And in that stillness, a question formed. Not about Adrian, about herself. What did she want? Who was she when she wasn't being someone's wife, someone's second thought, someone who smiled politely while fading in the background? That weekend she packed a small bag. Nothing dramatic. No slammed doors. No ultimatums. Just a weekend. A way to think, to breathe, to walk near the sea and listen to the wind without interruption. Daniel didn't fight it. Maybe deep down, he knew this had been coming long before Adrian ever entered their lives. Maybe he had felt the space growing between them, but didn't know how to reach across it. Or maybe he had grown used to her silence. As she drove away from the city, A strange sense of freedom washed over her. Not because of a man. Not because of romance. But because of clarity. It wasn't about choosing between two people. It was about choosing herself, for the first time in years. She didn't call Adrian, not yet. She didn't know what the future held. But as the ocean came into view, and the wind tugged at her hair, she smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole, not waiting, not longing, just present. That night, in a quiet seaside cottage, she painted again. This time, the woman on the canvas wasn't afraid. Her eyes were open. Her mouth slightly parted, as if about to speak. And finally, she would.